Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking all about Chinese classics. So recently, Mark from Book Time with Elvis made a video talking about the books that he really wants to read that are classic Indian, Chinese, and Japanese. And it got me thinking, because I've read quite a lot of Chinese classics and I love Chinese classics. It got me thinking, what are the Chinese classics I still haven't read and I want to read? So half of this video will be just me gushing about all the Chinese classics I have read and I absolutely love, and the other half will be me talking about the Chinese classics I have not read, but I really want to. Now, this is not an all-encompassing list. I'm sure I missed a bunch of Chinese classics on the list. I'm still learning about new Chinese classics, and when it comes to Chinese classics, I'm really only counting those books that are Qing Dynasty and before, so I'm not going to go anything after like around 1900. So let's get to the ones I've read and I really enjoy. So the first one is Chinese classics would not be complete without some classic poetry. And throughout Chinese history, there have been some incredible poets. I have a collection of Dufu's collected poetry, and this one I picked up very cheaply, and half of it is in Chinese and half of it is in English. I will also be putting a picture of the book that I had originally read, Li Pu and Tufu's poems in it, because this was a Penguin Classics edition and that was the original book that I read with their poetry collection in there. They both lived during the Tang Dynasty, so around 700 AD. The next one, and it is a quote that I have up here, Confucius, of course. He was one of the most respected philosophers in China and has impacted many generations of Chinese people, their way of life, their society. He himself lived in around 400 AD, give or take. I don't know if they know the exact dates of when he lived, but his sayings were collected and then passed down. I don't know the first original copy of his Analytics, which is just a collection of his sayings. I believe it was originally put together by his immediate followers. So did he actually say it? Was it just his followers saying that he said it? Who knows, but it's really interesting to understand his philosophy, and quite a bit of it I actually agreed with. There is also a Penguin Classics of that one, which I will show a picture of, so if you're curious to read it, I would recommend that one. I don't think that's the original one that I read. There are quite a few good editions of the Analytics by Confucius. The next one is one that isn't necessarily as accessible to a modern audience to read, and that is The Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. So he lived during the Han Dynasty, so I believe like 100 BC, and the Han Dynasty was right after the Qin Dynasty. The Qin Dynasty is the famous one where you have Qin Shi Huang building the Great Wall of China, or at least starting construction on it, and then also his terracotta warriors and his tomb being so big. So Sima Qian was a historian in the Han Dynasty who decided to collect all the origin stories and all the knowledge that previous historians had collected in China. So he wrote all about not only the Han Dynasty, the Qin Dynasty, but also the more ancient dynasties that are partial myth, partial history, like the Xia Dynasty and the Shang Dynasty. Really interesting book. How I originally read his book was in 2 volumes at my library, but I know that it's very hard to access now, so it may be harder to read for the average person, especially if you're not super interested in history, and it's also difficult to know when he talks about things, what is more of mythology, fantasy, and what actually happened. So I just took everything as like, this isn't real when reading him, but it's a very interesting book. The next book is, of course, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This is my copy. I got this at Barnes & Noble's, and I just got it for the aesthetic purposes. I've read this a few times. I got it from my library. I've listened to it on audiobook. It is basically a collection of short, I guess, not essays so much as a numbered advice, how to fight war and strategize with war. And it's funny, I was talking to my husband about this book the other day, and he was saying how he could never understand why this needed to be written, because a lot of the things that is discussed in this book are quite obvious. However, my husband pointed out that now he understood it a little bit more because Sun Tzu was writing this to wealthy nobles who had absolutely no common sense, who didn't really understand war or have a good brain cell in their head. They were like spoiled rich kids. They didn't know how to strategize war, so he was writing these immense basics that I feel like most strategists would be like, this is obvious, for these like rich, wealthy kids. So I just thought that was funny to look at, and it's an incredibly short read. The next one is Dream the Red Chamber by Cao Shuiqin. This is a Qing dynasty. This is one of the more recently published classics on this list. I read this years ago from the library, and it came out near 1800, I think late 1700s, near the end of the Qing dynasty. Kind of Romeo and Juliet-esque. It's like a Chinese version of Romeo and Juliet. It's not, but it very much gets into the societal norms of the Qing dynasty. So to read it as a modern reader, it might be a little bit, you don't understand the character motivations because the society is just so different from ours, but I loved reading this. It is very much a romance as in an adventure, not like a romance. I mean, I guess there is romance in here. It's not the same type of romance we think of nowadays. It's very much an adventure. So great book. I highly recommend it. And this one is the complete version, but you can get copies that are different parts. All right, the next one is A Journey to the West, also titled The Monkey King by Wu Chang'an. Also, I want to point out that even though I'm saying the authors of these books, this is the author that is often attributed to them. There's certain authors that, like for example, Du Fu, that we actually know, he wrote his poetry. But there are quite a few of these books, like Journey to the West, like a few that I will mention down the road, that we're not sure if the people who are attributed as writing them actually wrote them, or if storytellers cobbled it together, different parts, and kind of the person who it is attributed to is merely the person who wrote it down fully, if that makes sense. This book dates back to about the 1500s in the Qing dynasty, so quite early on in the Qing dynasty, and it is about a monkey who has aspirations to be super, super powerful, and he kind of works his way up to being the power of a god, gets in trouble with the gods, and then the gods kind of force him to lead a monk from India all the way to China, and that is supposed to be the origin story of how Buddhism came into China. And so it's mostly myth, but it is kind of centered around this real life religion, I guess, with Buddhism coming into China. So it is a really fun read. It is very much a fun, action-packed adventure. If you are less into like the history, the society of China, but you want just a fun adventure, this is the one on the list that I would recommend. So similar to The Analytics by Confucius, this is another one that is kind of similar. In fact, I'll include two on this list. The first one is the book of Chuang-Tzu, by Chuang-Tzu, and this is a collection of sayings that Chuang-Tzu, who was a 4th century BC philosopher, very similar to Confucius. His ideas were slightly different, but mostly the same. And his followers, again, wrote them down as they did with the Analytics of Confucius. And then there's also the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu being considered the founder or one of the founders of Taoism in China. And again, similar story to Confucius, where he is attributed to writing this down or speaking it, and his followers kind of spread the message. So all of these are really interesting philosophy texts. If you're interested in philosophy, they don't have a plot. They're all about like understanding morality and how the world works and how people should act and behave. Very, very much like that. It's less of like a story, like some some of these on this list. But I love Chinese philosophy, so those are the ones that I would recommend. Now let's get to the ones that I haven't read, but I really want to read. Quite a few of these I'm avoiding because of the length, because I've been so busy, because it's harder to get copies of some of these books, and it's harder to know which editions or which translations to pick. So if you've read any of these on the list and you're like, this is the translation to read, this is the edition to read, let me know down in the comments. I'd be curious to try to purchase like the best copy out there. So the first one is The Water Margin by Shinai An. In fact, I'm pretty sure The Water Margin is also partially attributed to the author of The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which we'll be talking about in a minute. So again, these books, just because they're attributed to one person does not mean that person authored them. China is weird. I'm sorry. This is coming from someone who is like absolutely obsessed with Chinese history. So also called The Outlaws of the Marsh. It was written in the 1300s. It follows a group of rebels who kind of rise up against the government in China to gain freedom, to overthrow the feudal system in China. It's kind of an adventure. It's an action adventure. Now, I'm pretty sure I did pick up a translation of this at one point from the library, and I read a bit of it, but I never finished it. I don't know why, if I found out that that was actually just the first volume and I hadn't gotten the complete copy or something like that. But I have actually read part of this, but I haven't completed it, so I do want to finish this and read it at some point. The next one is the Qinping Mei, which is often translated as The Plum in the Golden Vase or The Golden Lotus. It is attributed to, wait for this name, Lan Ling Xiao Xiao Sheng. This came out in around the 1600s, late 1500s. It is set within this household of this corrupt merchant, and it tells about the society, the social and political stuff going on during that time, and it is very much a examination of rural Chinese wealthy life within one of these very strict houses. Because of Confucianism, it was very strict. Like, the women had to not leave the houses without an escort. There were a lot of different rules about, especially for women, but for men as well. And this book, it seems like, kind of examines that. So I'm really excited to try to read this book at one point, but I have not found a copy. Next one, of course, no Chinese classic list would be complete without The Romance of the Three Kingdoms by Luo Guangzheng. So this was supposedly came out in the 1500s. Again, very similar era to Journey to the West, but it is considered probably the best Chinese classic. Don't know why I haven't read it. I think it's because I think it's almost 2,500 pages. Yes, 2,500 pages. I think that's the complete copy. At least the complete copy I've found is that length. So yeah, I've been avoiding it just because of the length, and I don't actually know that much about it. I believe it's, I saw a Chinese drama that was called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I've heard that it's not accurate at all to the book, so not going to trust that. But it is very much about some wars that were occurring during the Han Dynasty, back to the Han Dynasty when The Art of War was written. Romance of the Three Kingdoms pulls very much on future dynasties and future eras and their societies, much more than like if the book was actually written in 200 BC. So I've been wanting to read this for a long time, but I haven't yet. All right, so the next one it has several different titles. I'm going to say The Strange Tales of Pu Song Ling, by Pu Song Ling. The one that I'm putting up on the screen is just selections of it, which is called Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, which is the Penguin Classic edition of selections of this book. But basically it is a book of Chinese folklore, Chinese myths. Pu Songling lived around the 1700s, and I'm not sure if he came up with a lot of these stories, but he wrote them down, quite a few of them, that have in the future become very much Chinese classic myths and folklores. The next one is, I guess I'm going to just title it Mencius. Mencius was one of the disciples, I believe, to Confucius. And he lived around circa 300 BC in China, and he wrote down similar philosophy to Confucius. I've read excerpts of his writing, but I've never read his entire writing. So he is very similar to Confucius, and I have been wanting to read him because, like I said, I enjoyed The Analytics by Confucius, so I wanted to read Mencius, one of his main disciples. In fact, there is some supposition that The Analytics by Confucius was actually written by Mencius. I don't know if that's actually accurate. And the last one we were talking about is an actual romance, a love story, and that is, I'm going to call it The Peony Pavilion by Tang Xianci. This was written, again, around the 1500s. 1500s seem to be like the big era when it comes to Chinese classics. And it is like a love story, a romance between these two people. And it's kind of a tragedy, and there's ghosts involved. And I don't actually know much about it, but it sounds really interesting, and it's considered one of the greatest classics in Chinese literature. So there is my list. I'm sure that it's not complete because there are so many Chinese classics out there that are interesting and maybe not as in the forefront. I feel like certain ones most people who read historical fiction, read classics, have at least heard of, like The Romance of the Three Kingdoms or Journey to the West. But quite a few of Chinese classics I have never heard of, and I'm still discovering more. So if there's any that I didn't mention on this list that you have read and you've loved or you've heard really good things about, leave that down in the comments, because I'm always like adding new Chinese books to my list of Chinese classics to read. Maybe next year I should make that my goal, to like focus more on reading classics around the world. Have you read any of these books? Would you be curious to read any of them? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!